Alright, this is going to be our first crack at doing video notes. So what we're looking at here is World War One, and we're going to cover the beginning of World War One, how it started, why it started, some of the early action in the war. So that's what we're looking at here. Alright, this is going to be a big thing that we're going to cover in class, and something we're going to talk quite a bit about is the main causes of the war. Militarism, the alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Now, we've talked a good deal about imperialism, but we really haven't talked about either of the two, or the other three, sorry. The militarism aspect of it is when we were talking about, in the Gilded Age and even in the Progressive Era, being able to mass produce things in factories and the assembly lines. One of the things that countries start producing are war material. Now that has to do with the imperialism that we talked about earlier. These countries are competing with each other, and because they're competing with each other, they start to arm themselves, and they start to arm themselves with what we would consider more modern weapons, things like the machine gun and high-powered cannons, bombs, and eventually airplanes and tanks. But these countries keep arming themselves, and as countries continue to arm themselves, the tendency becomes that they want to use these large armies. Well, in order to protect each other from the outbreak of war, a lot of these countries also started to build alliances with each other, so that if one country declares war on another country would come to their aid. And many of the leaders at the time believed that this would ensure peace because no one would actually want to go to war. Actually, quite the opposite happens. Imperialism, we already talked about, that these countries were engaged in a real-life game of risk with each other, and that eventually this game was going to spill over into war. And last but not least is nationalism. Also, this period of time in history sees a rise in the increase of nationalism. These countries are competing against each other, and the whole idea of being proud of your country and that your country is exceptional compared to other countries starts to become very popular. But as a result, all four of these causes lead directly to the beginning of the war. But these causes alone aren't going to be able to start the war. It's going to have to take something else to really ignite that spark. Militarism, you can see here, a marching army. It really wasn't until prior to World War I, just prior to that, a lot of countries had what are called large standing armies, a permanent army. Used to be that if a country was going to war, they would draft, it would conscript a lot of people and then go fight the war. But now these countries have large professional standing armies. It becomes your job to be in the military. Also imbued with this is a sense of honor and duty to serve your country, to serve king and country, and the nobility that comes with that and the pride that comes with that. A little bit of nationalism seeks into that. And as I mentioned earlier, because of the massive industrialization that had happened at the turn of the century, countries can now produce more lethal, larger amounts of weapons. And these weapons are going to be used to their full effect during the outbreak and during the course of World War I. Most armies, especially European armies, were set up with officers and soldiers. Officers tended to come from the more noble class. They tended to be educated, whereas common soldiers could come from really any walk of life in Europe and eventually the United States, but they tended to be workers, peasants, farmers, the more common type of people, whereas the officers were more the upper class, and this did create some problems. The alliance system was supposed to protect these countries from war, when in fact it did the opposite. These alliances were made for mutual defense. Typically, they were made by countries that were culturally very similar with each other, whether it be by language or religion. Other times, it would be through royal marriage that these countries would form alliance with each other. But the problem with the alliance system is that while it's set up to protect each country from going to war, all it would take is one country to declare war on another one, and it would create what's called a domino effect. And all of these countries would declare war on each other. And before you know it, a war goes from being a regional war to being what eventually would become a world war. Now, the two big alliances that were formed prior to World War I and really continued throughout the war are the Triple Entente and the Central Powers. Central Powers, named so because most of these countries were located in Central Europe. The Triple Entente was made up of France, Great Britain, and Russia. They had pretty close alliances culturally, historically, and then as Russia would leave, the United States would enter in 1917. Now, these weren't the only countries that were involved in the alliance system. There were, many more countries. These happen to be the larger ones, and these are the ones that bore most of the cost of the fighting. Here we are, one of my favorite games, Risk. And as I said before, World War I is really the game of Risk playing out in real life. You had a scramble for colonies all throughout the world, and we kind of already talked about this time period. These colonies were used as a source of wealth for the countries that occupied them, and they used this wealth to feed their industrial machine and produce all kinds of stuff, finished goods, but also weapons. And a lot of this wealth was used to finance the military, used to finance things like large navies and eventually things like U-boats, dreadnought battleships. And without imperialism, without having colonies, a lot of these armies and navies couldn't grow to the size that they were. A lot of the colonies would also be pulled into the conflict, especially when it comes to the British Empire and the other Commonwealth states being pulled in and drawn into the conflict. And you have situations where soldiers are fighting on the European continent that aren't even from Europe, which is kind of unique. And the final nail in the coffin, well, I shouldn't say the final nail in the coffin, but the final cause, there's going to be one bigger nail that we'll see in a minute, is nationalism. And the whole idea of having pride in your country. And not only are you proud of your country, but the belief that your country is superior to other countries and that your culture is superior to other cultures. Also, though, you have a lot of nationalism spilling out into smaller countries or smaller regions that aren't even countries yet that want to become their own countries. Good example of this is the Balkans and the Slavic nations that want to form their own nations. They want to break away from what they're a part of, whether it's the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and have their own country that's apart from that. And obviously, not all of these empires want to see them go, so this causes fighting as well. But the big idea of nationalism is putting the interests of the nation, the interests of your people, over your own self-interests. As I mentioned earlier, the Central Powers are going to be countries located pretty much in Central Europe. That the Ottoman Empire is also a member of the Central Powers. And then you have the Triple Entente nations, United Kingdom, France, and Russia, and the Central Power squeezed in the middle. Here in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you have a lot of these nations that want to break away and form their own countries. Now, this is the event that's going to cause the dominoes to fall, and this is the spark that ignites World War I, is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. You have this gentleman on the left, Gavrilo Princip, who is a Serbian nationalist. Serbia is a region that's a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many people in Serbia want to break away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They see themselves as culturally different, linguistically different, religiously different. So they want to break away and form their own nation. And he is, definitely caught up in this cause. He, as a part of this, thinks it would be a good idea to assassinate the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand. He ends up killing him, and as a result, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declares war on Serbia. Serbia, small country, it's tied to Russia through a similar culture. Russia sees itself as the defender of the Slavs and the defender of the Serbian people. So they go to war and declare war on Austria-Hungary. As a result, Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Germany declares war on Russia because Germany has an alliance with Austria-Hungary, because France has a an alliance with Russia. They declare war on Austria, Hungary, and Germany, so on and so forth, until all of these countries declare war on each other, and then the war is on. They are all mobilizing and all at war with each other.